Very good. Good day. We're glad that you're with us for our study this evening. There's a wonderful expression as the book of Hebrews opens, and the writer will just simply say, and the translations will vary, in various ways and various means, God spoke to our forefathers in the past, but in these last days he has spoken to us through his Son, Jesus Christ. And I'm sorry, when I was little, I think our King James says in various ways and divers manners. The only divers that I knew had these masks on and these suits with these oxygen tubes. And just being little bitty, when I would hear various ways and divers manners, then that would come to mind, which has nothing to do with what the original writer is saying, but I always kind of chuckle when I read that. Lord willing, what I'd like to do tonight is just to briefly touch on some things about each of the major prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and then Ezekiel and Daniel. So we're going to go a little bit ahead of where we are in our reading, but this is why this is important. Through the years, I've got to talk with people who've never read their Bible, and one of the things that I found out is that, you know, you go along and there's nearly a book for event, and it's kind of like one of those megaphone things that as you get closer to the end, the volume of books is going to increase. And if people can kind of find their way, first of all, through the major prophets, then they have something to kind of put a peg on to put the other events in order. So that's what we're going to look at, is that God's going to use various ways, various means. In the past, Wayne, I've struggled with the term visual aid because for some people that's a little bit, trite is not the best word, but you know what I'm saying. For some people, a visual aid is something that's a little bit trivial. David Roper, who's just such an excellent Bible student, he likes the word object lesson. And God is going to use, especially these prophets' families, as a part of the object lesson of teaching the people who they are called to speak to in each generation. So we're going to just look at, like I said, a survey of those major prophets, and then just highlight some of the variety of the ways that God spoke to our forefathers by the prophets. The very first thing I want to notice is when we look at the prophet Isaiah, and again, as we're going to say, major events take place in the lives of the major prophets. Isaiah is going to have his ministry approximately from 740 to 700 BC. And what is significant is that right in the middle, in 721, the northern 10 tribes are carried away into captivity by the Assyrians. And you just think if there have been 12 of you for years, and then after this event there's only 2 of you, that was just a very sobering event, even for those who survived in the southern kingdom. We mentioned this last week, and this is again part of doing this. I like the little acronym Hosea, Isaiah, Micah, and Amos. Each of these are contemporaries, and with who we call the minor prophets, they're going to speak to the people in the north, trying to prevent the captivity, trying to call people to repentance, and they're not going to. And then Isaiah is going to continue to speak to the house of Judah, but right in the middle of the ministry of Isaiah is going to be the fall of the northern kingdom, and that's why I use the expression major events happen during the lives of the major prophets. When we come to Jeremiah, he's going to be a few years later, and you'll see dates approximately 626, and his life will go down into the 580s. But in the same way that during the ministry of Isaiah, the northern kingdoms are carried away into captivity, then it's during the time of Jeremiah that Jerusalem is going to fall. So we're going to be a few years later, And when our kids were small, we would always touch the corner of our eye and say, Jeremiah is the weeping prophet because he is in Jerusalem. J-E-R Jeremiah, J-E-R Jerusalem. Jeremiah is in Jerusalem when Jerusalem falls, and so therefore he writes a lament about the fall of Jerusalem. See the flow? So you've got Isaiah right in the middle of his ministries, the fall of the northern kingdom. The people are carried away. A few of them come back who are the Samaritans. And then during the time of Jeremiah, then there's going to be 3 different periods of times where Jerusalem is going to be captured, and finally, in 586, 587, then the city is destroyed and virtually all the people are carried off. But one of the significant things that is said, and we'll see this in another context here and just a little bit later, is that as God speaks to Jeremiah, and your heart just goes out to him when you read Jeremiah. There's so many things that he's trying to do, and eventually he's going to tell the people, you need to surrender to the armies who are outside. He's seen as a traitor. He's thrown in a well. He's beaten. All kinds of things happen. And bless his heart, he is such a faithful prophet under such difficult circumstances. We had a dear friend in Australia that Sheila met their family. Faith was, this lady was doing a frozen chicken cooperative. And so the more frozen chickens you bought, the cheaper they were. So they're cheaper than the store, but if we can buy a whole bunch of them, then they're even cheaper. And the contact was made with Faith, and eventually she and her 2 daughters start attending. Frank at some point decides he needs to go back to the Catholic Church. And over a period of time, though, fellowship and love and care, then Frank became a Christian as well. A lot of difficult things happened to Frank, and he really struggled after we had moved back, but always had to visit with him, a contact when we visited Australia, and he worked at the gas company. And so a friend would come by at 6 o'clock to pick him up, and his normal routine was to wake up, eat in about 15 minutes, and then read the good book until his ride came. And a number of things happened, and he just struggled. Faith went back to the world, and just a number of things. But on this particular trip, I was just visiting with him, and how are you doing? And then here it came, he said, isn't it amazing how faithful Jeremiah was through all the stuff that he went through? And I came home and told Sheila, I said, I think Frank is going to make it. And she says, well, why? And I said, he's got his nose back in God's Word again, and with the struggles that he's had in his life, none of us are going to have the struggles that Jeremiah had. And by getting back and reading this great prophet and all the things that happened to him, that was a part of sustaining him. And ever since, his email is stand_firm. And so reading Jeremiah gave him that sense of this is one of those things where we need to come to terms with faith and faithfulness. But Jeremiah is going to predict that the people are going to be in captivity for 70 years. And what we're going to see is that the first group of captives are going to leave in 606. And they're going to go into Babylonian captivity. Let me go ahead and give you the bottom line. Babylon's going to fall in 539. So 606, 539. And they're having this banquet, and I don't care how drunk you are, if a hand appears and starts writing on the wall, that's going to get your attention. and this hand comes out and starts writing, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin, up on the wall, and my color would change too in terms of just being shocked. They asked Daniel, and it's in scales, weighed, found in the balance, and wanting, and the Babylonian Empire falls that night, 539, and then within 3 years, Isaiah is going to call him at the end of chapter 44 and 45, my shepherd, my anointed one type thing. Cyrus is going to send the people back, and God's going to cause an entire kingdom to fall. The Medes and the Persians are going to come, in control, and within 3 years, they send the people back. So you subtract 536 from 606, and guess what you get? 70 years. And so God is going to foretell how long the captivity is going to be, at least from the first of the captives who are carried away. And these are things that are done by this wonderful man, Jeremiah. Let me just mention these two men. We'll come to them later. In the same way that here is Isaiah, so contemporaries are going to be Hosea, Micah, and Amos. A little bit later, when we get to Jeremiah, he also has two contemporaries, and one is Zephaniah. And I would tell our kids when they were small, Z is obviously the end of the alphabet, and he's going to talk about the last days. And here's this warning: if you don't repent, this is what is going to happen to you. So Zephaniah is one of the contemporaries. The other is this wonderful man, Habakkuk. And what a strange name for us today to try to learn. And in my mind, Habakkuk asked God very similar questions about the people as Job is going to ask about suffering. So Habakkuk is going to be the prophet to whom God says, I'm going to punish this people, and because of their wickedness and all the things that are happening, and I'm going to use the Babylonians to do that. And then Habakkuk comes back and says, but God, the Babylonians are worse than we are. And God tells Habakkuk, that's okay. In time, I'm also going to punish them. And in the middle of this wonderful book about questioning and God, why are you doing this, is this wonderful statement, the Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before him. So the contemporaries with Jeremiah are going to be Zephaniah and then also Habakkuk. The other two men, though, are very, very significant. And Ezekiel, and by now you know if it's an E-L, there's something about God. Ezekiel's name means God is strong. And let me just give it to you in a sentence. God is going to send Ezekiel and Daniel into captivity before the main group of people get there. And Ezekiel is going to be the prophet to the common people. He's going to live by the river and just talk with the people and work among them. God is also going to send Daniel, and Daniel's name means God is judge. And Daniel's going to be sent into the royal court. And so for the majority of the time that Daniel is in captivity, then the Babylonians are in control. And then, as we said, the handwriting comes on the wall. Babylon falls that night. And then he also rises to the top of the Mede and the Persian Empire as well. So again, here's a few more things about Ezekiel. Ezekiel's carried into captivity, and this is the second of the times that Jerusalem was conquered, 606, 598, 97, and this is when Ezekiel is taken away. And I like to call him the visual aid prophet. Again, David Roper has been at Eastside these last few years. Years ago, David Roper was doing flannel graph. David Roper was doing anything that you could do visually. David Roper not only did it, but he did it very, very well. And he also is a magician. And his specialty has been, they will have these contests, but his specialty is up close competitions. So the judge is just sitting right there, and you do your magic tricks with the judge just looking right there. And David Roper is always looking for something visual to illustrate, a lesson to illustrate God's truth. If you've been raised by school teachers, he comes by it honestly. The apple didn't fall far from the tree. And that, always looking for something visual to help with the message, is David Roper. Well, that's what I think of when I think of Ezekiel. And there's going to be a number of things, and we'll touch on a few of these that he does, but there's always visual things going on with Ezekiel and his proclamation to the people. He is going to see some very interesting visions. Both Daniel and Ezekiel are going to see visions, and during this time, God is going to speak to these prophets through the visions that they have. And one of Ezekiel's visions is he is literally going to see the glory and the Spirit of the Lord leaving the temple in Jerusalem. And I just kind of do this in terms of just trying to comprehend this sometimes. Here's a prophet who is hundreds of miles away. You go up the Fertile Crescent to the top, and you go down to Babylon, and he's in this far-off place. But before the final fall of the city of Jerusalem, and before the temple is destroyed, then here is God's prophet in captivity, and Ezekiel has this vision of the glory of God leaving the temple and leaving Jerusalem before it's actually destroyed. And I always just shudder when I read that, because here again, God spoke through the prophets, and he's going to convey that final fall of Jerusalem to and through the prophet Ezekiel. Daniel is also carried in captivity, but I want us just to make this note. Daniel is a teenager, and he leaves the city in probably 606. So he goes in one of those very early times. And as we said, Ezekiel is the prophet among the common people. He is called by the river Chebar, and the people are always coming to him, where Daniel is called by God, and he spends his time in the royal courts, first of all of the Babylonians, and throughout their existence, that kingdom falls, and then God raises him to the top of the Mede and the Persian Empire as well. But here's what's very important. If the Babylonian, well, let's do it this way. If Ezekiel is a teenager in 606, pick any date you want to. I don't know how old he is. Is he 15? Is he 16? But here's 606, and then Babylon falls in 539. Okay? So you're going to have over 60 years that he's in Babylon, going as a teenager. He's well possibly into his 70s plus, and then he rises to the top of the Mede and the Persian Empire before he's thrown into the lion's den. Okay? The flannel graph that I saw growing up was a young man being thrown into the lion's den. And we're all influenced by what we've seen. I mean, that's just a part of human nature. But then when you get to checking, okay, he goes into captivity at 606. The Babylonian Empire falls in 539. And then after that, he rises in the Mede and the Persian Empire, and that's when he's thrown in the lion's den. And so to me, it's a helpful context. Here's a man who's been faithful all of his life in a foreign land with very little kind of contemporary peer support around him. And here he is as an old man being thrown into the lion's den, and that's one of the marks of faithfulness. All of these prophets are faithful, but that's something that I think is very significant about Daniel. The other thing that I think of, especially with Ezekiel and Daniel, is that the center of God's activity of prophecy during this time of captivity moves from Jerusalem and then actually is transported to Babylon. And so the visions that both Ezekiel have and Daniel have are going to be very descriptive, first of all, of the destruction and the fall of the city, but God is going to give Daniel visions through especially the statue that Nebuchadnezzar has, and God is going to describe through Daniel, this is what's going to happen politically for the next 400 years. And you have the statue with the head, oh, that's you, Nebuchadnezzar, and then we're going to have the Medes and the Persians, and then we're going to have the Greeks, and then finally we're going to have the feet partly of iron and partly of clay, and that is going to be the Romans. And it's just very interesting to me that the center of prophecy, God speaking to his prophets, God explaining this is what's going to happen, moves from the city of Jerusalem, and then here are these two wonderfully brave, courageous men, and God then speaks to Ezekiel and Daniel, and we have no record of either one of them ever returning to die in their homeland. And as far as we know, they are going to die in a foreign land. But for example, Daniel 2:44, in the days of those kings, the Romans, God is going to establish a kingdom which shall never be, and you can fill in the blank, it's either broken or shaken or destroyed. And one of the prophecies of the coming of the kingdom and the church is that God tells Daniel in Babylonian captivity, there's going to come a day, and it's going to be 4 kingdoms later, 400 years later, that my kingdom is going to be established. It will never be broken. It will never be overcome. And God reveals that to Daniel while he's in captivity. So here's a brief summary just to kind of tie together these four men. When you think of Isaiah and his ministry, just be reminded that the northern 10 tribes, Israel, is carried away into captivity right in the middle. And Isaiah continues to speak to the kings of Judah and to warn the people, but that's the major event that happens in the life of that major prophet. When we come to Jeremiah, then 3 times Jerusalem is conquered during the time of Jeremiah. He is the weeping prophet because he is doing everything he can to call people back to the covenant of Moses. They will refuse to listen to him. And so toward the end of Jeremiah's ministry is then going to be the fall of Jerusalem. Because there were 2 previous times the city was captured, then God is going to send Ezekiel into captivity to minister among the common people and to speak to them. And then Daniel is also sent into captivity to look out for Israel's interest in the royal courts. What I'd like to do now is just look at some examples of how God spoke through their families. And in some cases, it's going to be actual family. And then in 2 cases, it's going to be lack of family. And I'll explain that as we go through. I just want to touch back on Hosea, a contemporary with Isaiah. And if you remember, Hosea is the only prophet in this latter time who actually lives in the northern kingdom. And so when we look at the prophets and their families, and these are going to be opportunities that God uses, and what did the Hebrew writer says? In times past, in various ways and in various means, God spoke to our forefathers through the prophets. And one of the ways that God is going to speak through the prophets is actually going to be through their families. We touched on this last week, but here is Hosea. Excuse me just a second. And you look at Hosea, God instructs him to take Gomer off the streets, to marry a prostitute, and to have children through her. But look at the prophetic names. The first one is going to be Jezreel, and God says through the firstborn, I'm going to punish the house of Jezreel. And so the oldest child is going to be named in terms of God's punishment very specifically. The second child is called Luaroma, no mercy, and she has not received mercy. And so the second child is going to indicate the time is running out. The clock is ticking. And because of your sinfulness, God will no longer have mercy on you. So that's the second child. And then the third child also has a prophetic name, and this is Lo-amah, which simply means not my people. A lesson that I just love to work through and to give is that as you go through not only the Old Testament and the New, there is this thread that runs all the way through the Bible where over and over God will say, and I will be their God and they will be my people. And this is kind of the dream of God. I will be their God and they will be my people. And so here we are as the warning of the minor prophet Hosea. Then his third child basically has the name, not my people. And God is just saying, I've done everything I can to call you back, and you are not my people because of your ties to idolatry. And then after all this happens, Gomer goes back to the world. And this is a quotation from chapter 3 again. God came to Hosea and says he wants to literally buy her out of the adulterous situation she's in. Go again and love a woman who is loved by another man and is an adulteress, even as the Lord loves the children of Israel, though they turn to other gods and they love cakes of raisins. So I bought her. I said to her, you must dwell as mine for many days. You shall not commit adultery or belong to another man. So will I also be to you. This is just heartbreaking. And this is God's instructions to this servant, my servants, the prophets. And one of the ways that God spoke through families was through the unfaithfulness of all things of Hosea's wife, and then the three children that have prophetic names. When you come to Isaiah, and if any of you are looking for names for boys and you don't have a short list of names, I have a couple to add to that. We're going to find in Isaiah 7 and 8 that God comes to Isaiah and says, I want you to go into the prophets, I want you to conceive a child, I want you to get witnesses. And so Isaiah does what God's asked him to. She conceives and bore a son, and call his name Maher-shalal-hash-baz. Now, I don't know if you call him Mal or Baz or whatever you want to call him, but again, here is a child conceived and born by the directions of God, and the child has a prophetic name. I have a grandmother that would say, bless his heart. Can you imagine a child having a name like that? And when you look at that, the name means the spoil speeds, the prey hastens. And then God says, before the boy knows how to cry, my father or my mother. So here he is. He's born, and before he's old enough to talk is what's going to be the way that God spoke through him. Then the wealth of Damascus and the spoil of Samaria will be carried away before the king of Assyria. So Isaiah has a child that is given a very specific prophetic name. When just prior to this, Isaiah goes to meet the king Ahaz, and this is in the southern kingdom. And again, here's an easy way to remember this. Ahaz is one of the worst kings in the southern kingdom, and Ahaz is only one letter away from Ahab. So Ahab was one of the worst kings in the northern kingdom, and here's Ahaz, and just one quick example. And again, I just shudder. At some point, Ahaz nails the doors of the temple shut. I mean, I just can't even hardly say that. How can the king of Judah nail the doors of the temple shut? What does that mean? We can't have the Day of Atonement. We can't celebrate the Passover. All of the feasts and all the things that God has asked us to do for all of these years, the king comes along and literally nails the doors of the temple shut, which is just kind of unbelievable. But before this other child was conceived, we find, and this is going to be in Isaiah 8, 3 and 4, is that child. Just previous, then God says, I want you to go forth and meet Ahaz. This is Isaiah. And I want you to take your son. And look at his name. His name is Shear-Jashub. And you phonetics people can probably do that better than I can, but that's a close run at it. And so the previous son is named A Remnant Shall Return. Do you see what we're saying? In times past, God spoke to the people through the prophets, various ways and various means. And so through Hosea, then it is his marriage with Gomer, their three children. And one of the ways that God speaks in the time of Isaiah is going to be through sons that are given very specific prophetic names. Here's the one, though, that's really sad. When you come to Jeremiah, there's also something significant about his family, and that is you're not to marry. I don't want you to have a wife. People are going to starve. All of these things are going to take place in the city of Jerusalem. And so God comes to the prophet Jeremiah. And if you have an outline, it's on the second page. You shall not take a wife, nor shall you have sons or daughters in this place. And I want you to think about this. No matter how difficult things are as a prophet, wouldn't it be nice at least to come home to a wife that supports you and helps you with what you're doing? Now, Wayne, as a principal, I'm sure you've never had a bad day at work with either teachers or parents or anything else, anything else like that. But isn't it wonderful when we've gone through different times to at least come home and have somebody to either listen to or console? And I want you to think about how lonely this is. God says, well, God knows they're going to be eating their children before the city's destroyed. And so while it is a cruel and hard thing to do, rather than adding burden upon burden, then God comes to Jeremiah and says, don't marry. I don't want you to have a wife. I don't want you to have children. And again, God speaks through the prophet in the fact that he is not to have children because they shall not be lamented. This is in Jeremiah 16, or buried, and they will not be as dung on the surface of the ground. Those who are here will perish by the sword and famine. Their dead bodies will be food for the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. And then God also says, don't go to the house of lament and mourning. And again, my heart goes out to Jeremiah because you are not to have a wife. But it gets worse, at least from a human point of view. Here is Ezekiel in captivity, and as he speaks to these people who have foreheads of flint and hearts of stone type thing, God comes to him and says, oh, by the way, your wife is going to die. The city of Jerusalem is about to fall, and as a visual aid, as an object lesson for the grief and the mourning that God feels about the fall of the city, tonight your wife is going to die. Okay? I don't know about you, but my first thoughts would be, God, leave her out of this. I'm happy to be the prophet, but please don't do that. And notice what is said, and we're in Ezekiel 14. I'm about to take away the delight of your eyes from before you at a stroke. You shall not mourn, you shall not weep, nor shall tears run down. You can sigh, but not aloud. Make no mourning for the dead. Bind on your turban, put on your shoes, do not cover your lips, do not eat the bread of mourners. I spoke to the people in the morning, and at evening my wife died. And on the next morning I did as I was commanded. I'm sorry, this is in Ezekiel 24. I don't even have words to express this. I mean, how heartbreaking is this going to be to have been carried off into captivity, and at least you have your wife with you, and then God comes to you and says, oh, by the way, tonight your wife is going to die. No funeral type things, no mourning. I want you just to go about your business tomorrow as if nothing happened. And when you read what takes place, God is talking about the fall of Jerusalem is coming, and I want you to speak to my people. And then this is at the end of Ezekiel 14. He says, you will be a sign to them, and they will know that I'm the Lord. At various times, the prophet Ezekiel literally is struck dumb by God, and he can't speak. And so the prophet will go for days not even being able to communicate. And then when something happens, God will give him speech again and will be able to talk. And this is part of the way that God spoke through the families of these men. So we look at this expression, and I looked at the King James. It's sundry times in divers manners. So we have Hosea marries a prostitute, and their children are objects lessons. Her unfaithfulness is parallel to the unfaithfulness of God's people. God is also going to send Isaiah and tell him, and you have to read this to kind of believe it, I want you to loosen the sackcloth from your loins. This is Isaiah 20. Take off your shoes, and I want you to walk naked and barefoot for 3 years as a sign against Egypt and Ethiopia. This is again just kind of hard for us to comprehend and imagine. Here's the prophet of God sometimes called the royal prophet because of all the things that he writes. And part of what God tells him to do is walk naked and barefoot for 3 years as a sign. Isaiah is also going to cause the shadow on the sundial to go back 10 degrees, another way that God spoke. God's going to come to Jeremiah and says, I want you to take a waistcloth, and I want you to go to the Euphrates River and bury it beside the river. Now, if you know a map of Palestine, here you are down here in the area of Jerusalem, and you're going to go to the very, very top to the Euphrates River, dig a hole, and bury this waistcloth beside the river. And then later the word of the Lord says, I want you to go dig it up, and it's spoiled and it's rotted. And again, this is another way that God spoke to the people. The city surrounded, the captivity is about to happen. All these various things are taking place. And God tells Jeremiah, I want you to go buy a field from a relative. Weigh out the price, buy a field. And you think, why would you do this? The city's about to be destroyed. Oh, the days are coming when I will bring people back. And once again, fields will be bought and will be sold in this area. Ezekiel, as the visual aid prophet, God says, I want you to come along, shave your beard, shave your hair, put it together, put it in 3 different amounts. Part of it I want you to cut up with a sword. Part of it I want you to burn. And part of it I want you to throw out to the wind. That's what's going to happen to my people in captivity. The people in Jerusalem when the city's destroyed. And so literally, shaving his head and his beard and weighing those 3 things out was one of the ways that God spoke. Another one of these, and you'll find this in Ezekiel 4, and I just kind of laugh when I read these. God says, I want you to build like a siege, and here's these bricks. And this is going to be again about the siege and the destruction of Jerusalem. And I want you to lay on your side 390 days on your left side and 40 days on your right side. I will bind you up, and then I want you to get the grain and all this stuff ready. You can eat this amount, this very limited amount. And sometimes if you're in certain health food stores, you'll see Ezekiel bread. And Ezekiel bread is made from the ingredients that God told the prophet that he could have. And God spoke to his people in various ways, and one of those is Ezekiel is going to lay on his side for 390 days. And then, as we said earlier, Ezekiel is going to see the vision of the glory of God leaving the temple. When you come to Daniel, a lot of Daniel's are interpretation of dreams, and he will, as we noted earlier, interpret Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And then here is going to be God's plan for the next 4 centuries. And looking at our English Bible, when we finish that last chapter of Malachi, then we know we're going to have 4 centuries before the angels are going to come and they're going to announce the coming of the Christ. And God gives a blueprint, a very specific blueprint of the rise and the fall of kingdoms for the next 400 years to his prophet Daniel, who is in captivity. Daniel is going to read the handwriting on the wall, as we mentioned earlier, and tell of the coming of the fall that night of the kingdom of Babylon. And then a couple of these visions that Daniel have, like for example, one of these is in Daniel 8. He will see a vision, and then it says, I lay sick for some days. I was appalled by the vision and did not understand it. So these are samples. There are others, but these are samples of ways that God spoke in various times, in various ways. One of the others that's very dramatic, God tells Jeremiah to have one of his servants he writes some things in a book. I want you to tie it to a stone, and again, take it up to the Euphrates River and throw it in the river. And you'll find that in Jeremiah 51 and 52. So the final things I want to notice is this. It's very interesting as these prophets speak and prophesy. There are at least 2 occasions where a later prophet is going to mention something that he either knows or has heard from a former prophet. So here's Jeremiah. Jeremiah's in Jerusalem, the weeping prophet, and you'll find in chapter 26 and 18, he says Micah of Moresheth. Oh, Hosea, Isaiah, Amos, Micah. So years later, the prophet Isaiah says, Micah prophesied, thus says the Lord, Zion shall be plowed as a field, Jerusalem will be a heap of ruins, and the mountain of the house a wooded height. And so here's the prophet Jeremiah remembering something that God said to the prophet Micah earlier. Another one, and this is always amazing to me, here's Daniel in captivity, and in captivity he has a copy of the book of Jeremiah. And you'll find this in Daniel chapter 9. Daniel perceived in the books the number of years which, according to the word of the Lord, to Jeremiah the prophet, must pass before the end of the desolations of Jerusalem, namely 70 years. Okay, just do this very quickly. If he is carried away in 606 as, and I think possibly a late teenager or something, he knows exactly when the first captivity took place, and then he reads Jeremiah and says it's going to be 70 years, and so then Daniel is able to know exactly when the captivity is going to end, because in Babylonian captivity, hundreds of miles away, somehow he has a copy, he has heard of the teaching and the prophecy of Jeremiah, and he knows then when the captivity is going to end, and he knows when God's people are going to go back, and that's another way that God spoke through the prophet. So here's our last thought today. When we are in the book of Genesis, and God is going to take his people out of the land of Canaan because of the famine, he's going to take them into Egypt. He sends Joseph ahead, and Joseph is in Egypt for 13 years before the brothers show up because of the famine. And so I think of this as bookends, as a parentheses. At the opening of the Old Testament, God sends one of these godly, faithful, my word is sterling character. You know, he tells Potiphar's wife, how can I sin against God and do this? And so God sends a godly, faithful young man into Egypt, into prison, to be there to care and preserve for his people before they come. Now that we're toward the end of the Old Testament, then God is going to send Daniel, and God is going to send Ezekiel, this time into Babylonian captivity, and they are already there before the larger group of captives come after Jerusalem falls in 587, 586. And this is one of those things that is just always amazing. We see the design and the handiwork of God, and both at the beginning and then at the end of the Old Testament, in one case in Egypt and in the other case in Babylon, God is sending these just wonderful young men ahead into very difficult situations, into captivity and into prison. And because they are there before God's people show up, then God is going to work through them, and God is going to minister to his people, even though they're in a foreign land, through the godliness of these particular young men. And that's why when I come across this wonderful expression in the Old Testament, God will call them my servants, the prophets. I mentioned this is an expression from my father. He would just simply say, these guys have a lot of starch in their shirt. These are just some of the most amazing, faithful, godly people that you'll find in Scripture. And the Hebrew writer says, in times past, God spoke through various means and various ways to our forefathers through the prophets, but in these last days he has spoken to us through his Son, and therefore we are not going to be surprised when we come to Jesus that I like to use the expression, Jesus is going to wear the mantle of the prophets, and both in life and in speech and behavior is going to be very much like those wonderful prophets of old. God bless. Thank you for your time of being with us today.